Hello and welcome to Non-Inkables. This is going to be part one of a multi-part series about the Lorcana Comprehensive Rules. So this is a document published by Lorcana. It's super official, and it is 45 pages long, which is pretty long. And so I have tried reading this in the past, and it like there's only so long I feel like my attention span will go. But I think this is an important topic because there have been so many drama things based on rules that I think it is important for all of us to really go through the rules and learn all of them together so that we don't get rule sharked or lose for a dumb reason, not like an actual playing reason. Because I feel like that is the worst when you lose for something that is not even how you're playing the cards, it's just some technicality, you know? So in the resource section of the Lorcana page, there's this document, the comprehensive rules. There's also a community code. There's also tournament rules. There's also play correction guidelines and then player's guide. So you are supposed to start with the player's guide or the videos. And that came out with first chapter to kind of get the basics. And then this is more like all the technicalities, nitty gritty stuff. And then there are different rules for the tournaments. Not necessarily different rules, I would say additional rules that apply for the tournament. So we'll also do that in a separate video. And then the play correction guidelines, that basically outlines like what happens. Like if you break a rule, what happens? So let's get started with the comprehensive rules. Okay, so the comprehensive rules were published on August 9th, 2024, and they were last updated on November 22nd, 2024. I don't know for sure, but I'm guessing, actually, I don't know why it was updated. I was going to say it's because of Bucky, but I don't think that officially is even in the rules. But maybe it is. We'll see when we get there. And so they do put a note at the very beginning that is like, hey, this is like high level and not a good way for you to learn how to play the game. Don't use this if you're trying to learn how to play the game. Instead, use the app or like watch the videos, the introductory videos, which I think are on YouTube and also in the app. And then they have a little introduction about what this talks about. And then they've made some updates, which they've color coded into sapphire, aka blue, and then text that they moved to a different location is in amber. And so then next is the content. So let's go over that. So there are 10 like sections of this document. The first one is concepts, and then 2 is before the game, 3 is actual gameplay, 4 is turn structure, 5 is cards, 6 is cards type, 7 is abilities, 8 is zones, 9 is damage, 10 is words, and then there's a glossary at the end. So today we will start with section 1, which is concepts. So there are 9 subsections in this section 1. There's general, golden rules, active player, opponent, playing cards, type of abilities, the bag, player's cards, game state check, and multiplayer games. So first subsection of the first section. So under concepts, the big overall section, this is the subsection general, so 1.1. So 1.1.1, so the first rule in here basically says that Lorcana is played in many languages, and for gameplay, the English cards, rules, and rulings and clarifications are official. So when in doubt, just go to whatever the English card says, because I think this is the first, like Lorcana is developed in English, and so this is like home base, and maybe there's like some issue in translation. So I think in the past, there have been errata cards in different languages because the translation was a little wonky. I think regarding like bodyguard and stuff from set 1, 1.1.1 means English is the rule. Those rules are the rules. 1.1.2, so it says card text and rules may be updated or corrected. The most current updated or corrected information is the official version for gameplay. So I think there have been a couple cards that have been updated for like they put the wrong artist or like the translation thing, but the only main card that has been like really updated or changed is Bucky. And so this would apply like if you have the old version of the Bucky card, which I think most people do, where he's still a 2-drop and he still has ward, he's 1/1, and his effect happens when you play a Floodborn. That is technically, if you were to play, you should be using Bucky like he is the new version, the 3 cost, no ward, you have to shift the Floodborn character. And so even though your card may say something like you have to use the most updated card. You can't be like, oh, I have the old version, so I can do the old version effects. Next, 1.1.3, Disney Lorcana is a game played with 2 or more people. Each player needs a deck of Disney Lorcana cards that they'll use in the game, which seems basic, and they will go over decks later in the rules. 1.1.4, each player needs a way to track their lore total and mark damage on characters and locations. This can be any method players find convenient that is clear to all players in the game, meaning you can use a lore counter, you can use the app, you can use technically a dice, like a 20-sided dice. However, and they talked about this in the next rule, 1.1.5, Disney Lorcana tournaments may have additional rules that can affect the ones in this document. Please refer to the Disney Lorcana TCG tournament rules for further reference. So in general, casual play, you can use whatever you want for lore, but in the tournament rules, it'll say like you have to record lore on paper. And then 1.1.6 says some cards include reminder text set in italics. Reminder text isn't rules text, it's only a memory aid and may vary changing the meaning without changing the meaning of keyword rules. So if there is text in your card that is italicized, that just means that it's like a reminder to you, but not like rule binding as opposed to non-italicized words. So that is all of the general concepts, so section 1.1. So now we can move on to 1.2, which is golden rules. So the first golden rule of Lorcana: if the text of a card contradicts a game rule, the card effect supersedes that rule. So basically the card effect overrides the general rules. So for example, the example they give is the game doesn't allow a character to challenge a ready character, but a player with a character with an ability that reads this character can challenge ready characters. The ability overrides the game rule and allows that character to challenge a ready character. So examples specifically of this, I believe that Cinderella Stout-Hearted can challenge ready characters if you play a song. The Steel Tiana lets you challenge ready characters, I think, if you have no cards in hand. You could play Pick a Fight, which would let one of your characters challenge ready characters. 1.2.2, if a rule or effect prevents something from happening, that rule or effect supersedes other rules and effects that allow it to happen. So if you have, so their example is if an effect says that the player can't play actions, another effect instructs the player that they can play an action for free, that player still can't play an action. So for example, if you play a Pete and he says, no, you can't play any actions, and then your opponent tries to play Naveen, which says you can play an action, like a song, which is an action, 5 cost or less for free, he can't play a song because you can't play any action. So basically all the rules that are like, you can't do this are stronger than the rules that are like, you can do this for free or you can do this. Next rule is 1.2.3, and it is just do as much as you can. If an effect tells the player to do something, the player does as much as possible, even if some parts of the effect can't be done, except for in specific cases. And they'll talk about the specific cases later. The example they give is Strike a Good Match has an effect that reads draw 2 cards, then choose and discard a card. If an effect prevents the player of this action from drawing any cards, they still have to choose and discard a card. And I did look ahead to like what the specific cases are. And it's basically, it relates to cards that list one or more costs or effects in a single clause resolved based on what the intervening word is. So for example, most cards you have are like, you have A to B. So like you have to, the player must pay the cost described in the first part of the clause A. So they have to do A. If they can't do that, then they can't do the second part. So for example, if your card says banish chosen item of yours to deal 5 damage to chosen character, if the player doesn't have an item to banish, then they can't do the second part of dealing the 5 damage, right? So that's how most cards are written. There are also cards that are A, then B. So for example, Strike a Good Match is draw 2 cards, then, or draw a card and then choose and discard a card. So if it's A, then B, you just do it as much as possible, even if you can't do part of it. And then there's also cards that are A and B. So the examples they give are for the Queen commanding presence. So whenever this character quests, chosen opposing character gets -4 for this turn, and chosen character gets +4. So if the opponent doesn't have any characters, then they can't be chosen. You can't do part A, but you can still do part B where you get +4. So those are kind of the exceptions where really, I think the only exception is that first one where if it's written A to B, so you do A first and then you can do B. If you can't do A, then you can't do B. So you would not be resolving the card to like, you wouldn't be resolving the effect as much as possible. So that's where that doesn't apply. Next rule is 1.2.4. So choices that are made as part of an effect are made as the effect is resolving and not as a part of playing the card or using the ability with the effect. So the example they give is the active player has a Let the Storm Rage On in their hand and no characters in play. The opponent has a Cogsworth Grandfather Clock, which has Ward in play and no other characters in play. So Let the Storm Rage On has an effect that reads, deal 2 damage to chosen character, draw a card. When the active player plays Let the Storm Rage On, the opponent isn't sure if they can play it since there are no other characters in play for them to choose. The choice of character happens as the effect is resolving, though, not when the card is played. So therefore, the person can still play Let the Storm Rage On. So they play the card, they pay the ink, they play the card. Because they can't choose Cogsworth for the effect because he has Ward, and they don't have any characters to deal damage on, they don't deal damage to anybody, and then they can still draw a card without dealing 2 damage. However, so basically illustrating that the choices that you make as part of an effect are made as the effect is resolving. So you can still play the card, even though you can't deal the 2 damage, right? Because playing the card happens first, and then whatever the card says happens second. However, kind of like a little different scenario would be if you had a character on board if you had a character on board, then when you play the Let the Storm Rage On, you have to do the card as much as possible, right? So it says deal 2 damage to chosen character, not to opposing character. And so in that case, unfortunately, the only character you could choose would be your own character. So you would have to do 2 damage to your own character and then draw a card. However, if you have no characters, then there's nobody for you to choose. If the opponent's characters all have Ward, then you just get to draw a card, and it becomes just like draw a card. So that's 1.2.4, and that is the last of the golden rules. So really only 4 golden rules. So basically, the card supersedes the game rules, and then if a rule or effect is preventing something from happening, that supersedes the other effects, and then 3 would be do as much as you can, and 4, the choices that are made as part of effect happen as the effect is resolving, not when you're playing the card. Okay, so next section 1.3 is just active player. It just defines what that is. So when a player starts their turn, they become the active player, and then when they end their turn, they are no longer the active player. 1.4 is opponent. So anyone the player is playing against is the opponent. That's 1.4.1. And then 1.4.2, some game formats allow a player to designate one or more players as teammates. Such teammates are identified before the game starts. As the teammates aren't playing against each other, they aren't opponents to one another either. So this would apply to like when you're playing Ursula's Return, where everybody is a teammate against Ursula, or in some multiplayer formats. You can have a team. 1.5 is playing cards. So 1.5.1, players can play a card whenever they are the active player and there are no effects to resolve. To play a card, the player reveals it from their hand and pays the cost. So there is like a whole section on how to play cards, what happens first, blah, 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 which we will get into in a later video because that is a different section. But basically, you can only play a card if there's no effects to resolve, and you have to show what card you're playing and then pay the cost. 1.6 goes over types of abilities. So 1.6.1, I assume this part, I'm not sure if this part will get updated. So types of abilities, 1.6.1, there are several kinds of abilities in Disney Lorcana TCG. So this is like time for technical jargony stuff. So 1.6.1.1, the first of these is keywords. Keywords are short or shortened phrases that represent a larger ability or abilities. And it says see section 10 for a full list of current keywords. 1.6.1.2, so the second part of this is triggered abilities. Triggered abilities continuously look for a specific condition and have an effect when the conditions are met. And triggered abilities they go over in section 7.4. 1.6.1.3, activated abilities. So activated abilities have a cost and effect that occurs if the cost is paid. Activated abilities follow the rules in section 7.5. 1.6.1.4, static abilities. So static abilities are effects that are continuously active, either for a fixed length of time or for as long as the card generating the effect is in play. Static abilities follow the rules in section 7.6. 1.6.1.5, replacement effects are generated by some static abilities. These replace one effect with another. Replacement effects follow the rules in section 7.7. So I feel like this is where a lot of the meat of confusion can happen, is with these keywords and whether the abilities are triggered, activated, static, or replacement. Next in type of abilities is 1.6.2. Whenever an effect would affect multiple players at the same time, the active player resolves the effect first, then in turn order, each other player resolves that effect. So, for example, Donald Duck, Perfect Gentleman, has the ability Allow Me that reads, at the start of your turn, each player may draw a card. While the triggered ability is resolving, the active player resolves their part of the effect first and draws a card. Then, in turn order, each other player resolves their part of the card and draws a card. Once all the players have finished resolving their respective parts of the effect, so have all drawn a card, it has fully resolved and the game continues. And next section is 1.7, the bag. And I feel like the bag is anytime there's any controversy, it's always about like abilities and people are like, oh, well, it's in the bag, blah, blah, blah. So pay attention. 1.7.1, the bag is the zone where triggered abilities wait to resolve. It is not a physical zone, but a way to picture the process of resolving triggered abilities. Think of each triggered ability as a marble and the bag as a place where you put them until they're resolved. Each marble is separate from every other marble, and a player can look through the bag of marbles and select the one they wish to resolve next. So I think the bag sometimes probably confuses more experienced TCG players than new people. So to me, I was like, okay, everything's in the bag, makes sense. But I guess in other games, they have what's called a stack. And so the abilities kind of go into a stack and then you have to do them in order. Whereas in Lorcana, because they're all in a bag, you can do them in whatever order you want to do them in. And they'll go into this next. So 1.7.2, it's possible for both active player and their opponents to add triggered abilities to the bag at the same time. Resolving these abilities follows the rules in section 8.7, which is all about the bag. So that is going to be a big, meaty section, I think, that we will get to. Next section, 1.8, players' cards. So 1.8.1, cards a player brings to the table in their deck are their cards, and that player makes any decisions necessary for the card and its effects unless otherwise specified by an effect. So for example, Medusa, right? You play Medusa, you can remove a character with 3 strength or less. You get to make that choice. However, if you play Lady Tremaine, your opponent gets to choose, and it says it on the card. So this rule is basically like the person playing the card gets to choose unless the card says otherwise. 1.8.2. his/her/it/their. When a card refers to his, her, its, or their player, it is referring to the player who played the card. When a card refers to his, hers, its, or their turn, it is referring to the player's turn. And I think this is just a complication because of how Romance languages do their pronouns. So, like, for example, in Chinese, you would just say ta. For his, hers, its, their. It's all ta. And the written form is different depending on the gender and if it's human or not. However, I guess then it would probably just use the default, technically male one, but it is the side particle. So for ta, for a girl, it would be a girl side particle, but for boy, it's just like human. So it covers everybody. Yeah, it's just like this. I feel like this rule is necessary because of how the English language works. And then 1.8.3 is you, yours, yours. So card effect address the player who played the card. When the card refers to you, your, or yours, it's referring to the player of the card, even if the ability containing the reference was granted by an opposing effect. And then next, game state check. I feel like this is also kind of a meatier section and it's newer. There's a lot of blue and a lot of amber in this section that they added. And so another meaty section of things that are very applicable. So 1.9.1, there is a set of conditions the game checks for with certain required actions happening when one or more of these conditions is met. This is called the game state check and is made up of 2 parts. The game state condition and the required action. So the game state condition is a specific circumstance the game state can achieve. A required action is what happens in the game when a game state condition is met. The following are the conditions that the game state check looks for and the required action each creates. So 1.9.1.1, if a player has 20 or more lore, that player wins the game. So basically, anytime anyone has 20 lore or more, that person wins, right? 1.9.1.2, if a player attempted to draw from a card from a deck with no cards since the last game state check, that player loses the game. So that is how you lose, by getting what's called milled. So essentially, usually it's in a deck that plays Whole New World. They play Whole New World a bunch of times, and then you run out of cards to draw. Usually because you've also been drawing cards, and then you lose. I have lost by this once at LCQ. I got milled by Blue Steel, and then I've done it to somebody online playing like a Jafar wheel deck. And then the last game state is 1.9.1.3. If a character or location has damage equal or greater than its willpower, that character or location is banished. Next little section is 1.9.2. A game state check is made at the end of every step, after any action or ability is finished resolving, and after each effect in the bag is finished resolving. So during a game state check, first check and complete all win and loss conditions. So see if anyone's at 20 lore and see if anybody's run out of cards. And so it says first check and complete all win and loss conditions and required actions. Then if there are no win or loss conditions met, check and complete all other conditions and required actions. Once all required actions are complete, the game state check repeats until there are no further required actions to complete. Triggered abilities that occurred during this process are then added to the bag to resolve. So the little subsection here is 1.9.2.1. Any required actions generated from a game state check happen in turn order. If a player would win and lose the game at the same time as a result of a same game state check, that player wins the game. So I'm assuming this is probably like if you play, how would this happen? I'm trying to think of an idea when this would happen. So you would probably have to play a card that forces you maybe to draw a card, say like Genie. So not like Rabbit where it's a May ability, but Genie. And then maybe you have a card out that says when you play a character, you can get a lore. So you play the Genie and say you have no more cards left in your deck, right? You play the Genie, you would get the lore and win, but you also ran out of cards, so you would lose. But based on this rule, if you win, then you win. That's it. So you wouldn't actually lose. Interesting. I don't know if this has ever happened, but I like that it's written out. Next section is 1.9.3. Once a required action is completed, the game state check occurs again. So remember, it says you have to keep checking until there's no more actions to complete. 1.9.4. Abilities that trigger as a result of a game state check are added to the bag as soon as the check and any required actions are fully completed. 1.9.5, if multiple required actions would happen at once, a single combined required action takes place and all of the required actions happen simultaneously. And then the last little part in this first section, actually not little, it's a long part, is 1.10, so multiplayer games. 1.10.1, so the first part of the multiplayer games is multiplayer games are played with 3 or more players. Team games are a subset of multiplayer games that are not covered in this document. So basically all team games are multiplayer games, but not all multiplayer games are team games. It's like the whole, when you're in school and all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares stuff. So 1.10.2, multiplayer games follow the same rules as two-player games with the following exceptions. So 1.10.2.1, at the end of each player's turn, play proceeds to the player on their left rather than going back and forth across the table, which makes sense, right? You can't go back and forth when there's multiple people. So to the left, aka counterclockwise. 1.10.2.2. If an ability requires more than one player to do something at the same time, the active player does it first, then proceeds to the left one player at a time until all players are done. So we talked about this before in the example with Donald Duck, where the active player draws a card and then each person to the left draws a card until everyone's drawn a card, but in order. 1.10.2.3, if a player must draw a card and their deck has run out, they lose and must immediately leave the game. All of that player's cards and effects are removed from the game, including any static effects that would have ended during their current or future turns. So that's interesting and good to know. So like, say you're playing some multiplayer game where it's like battle to the end, I guess whoever wins, but say that you are like trying to mill everybody. And so if one of your opponent runs out of cards, they lose and they have to take away all of their cards so that those effects no longer happen. So that's good that you don't have to still consider their effects in future turns. And then next, so that was all the section about the exceptions to the two-player game rules. This next little section is 1.10.3, so still under multiplayer games. It says some multiplayer game formats use simultaneous turns. 1.10.3.1, during a simultaneous turn, all players on the same team progress through the phases and steps of the game at the same time. During the main phase, the players can take any turn action they could take normally in any player order they wish. Players must complete one turn action in its entirety before moving on to the next turn action. So this just makes it seem, I just like to think of this as like all the players on one team. The team is like the player. And so both people can do stuff at the same time because they're the same player, team player, you know? Oh my goodness, I set off confetti. 1.10.3.2, if triggered abilities or effects are added to the bag by multiple players during a simultaneous turn, these triggered abilities or effects are added to the bag by the team as a whole, and the order in which they are resolved is chosen by the team. Otherwise, resolving follows the same rules as found in section 8.7, which is bag. They do to give an example of this. So that says 3 players are members of the same team taking a simultaneous turn. During the ready step of the beginning phase, all 3 players ready their cards at the same time. During the set step, all 3 players gain lore from locations they have in play, and then add any effects or abilities triggered during the ready step to the bag at the same time. In the draw step, all 3 players draw a card from their deck at the same time. After the game moves into the main phase, the players take a simultaneous turn together. The first player wants to put a card into their inkwell, the second wants to quest, and the third has to decide to have one of their characters challenge an opposing character. The players can decide on the order of these turn actions, but each turn action must be completed in its entirety before the next player can act. During the end of the turn phase, the players declare the end of their turn. All triggers are added to the bag at the same time, and all this turn effects end at the same time. And so basically, the whole team is like one big turn, one big team, so one big turn. So they all do everything together. And I think this matters most probably in the main phase. If people, it depends on how the game is set up. And I feel like there haven't been that many multiplayer events that have happened. So I played in one at Gen Con, and I think there was one at the North American Championships LCQ. But it would be important if, like, you had Shirkan. So when one of your characters challenges another character, you get a lore. You would want to challenge first before, like with your other characters, before doing Shirkan. And if you're all on a team, you got to kind of communicate that in the team. So important. So that is it for section 1. Not too bad. It's just the beginning. And I feel like good overview. And then next videos will be all of the other sections. We're going to go through everything. I'm going to try to come up with good examples of where issues might come up. And like our local Discord of like the Contra Costa area, we've kind of talked about this recently quite a bit. And specifically with like interesting scenarios. For example, there's that Peter Pan card that comes in Exerted, and it says like one of your opponent's characters has to challenge this Peter Pan card or else they can't get any lore, right? And so we're like, what happens if you challenge this Peter Pan with a goat? Like, do you get the lore from the goat? Because the goat would be banished. And it's interesting because when we discuss it, like some people will be like, oh, well, all the triggered abilities go in the bag, so you get to decide, blah, blah, blah. But to me, when I was reading the rules, I was like, oh, well, the challenge happens. And so then Peter Pan's effect has been met, so it doesn't apply anymore. And then after that, the goat dies, right? So we will talk about that when we get to those parts. But hopefully this is informative for you guys, and you will continue to watch the series. We're going to do all of them. And yeah, let me know if you have questions. And that's it for me. As always, keep shuffling, and hopefully you don't end up with a whole handful of non-inkables like me. All right, bye.